This is the Breaker.news podcast for the week of June 2nd, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of the Breaker.news and host of the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 345. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support the Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the Big Deal feature, June 4th marks 35 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing, the day in 1989 when China's government slaughtered students who were demanding democracy in China. From the Breaker.news archive, highlights from interviews with Tiananmen Square survivor Zhou Fengsuo and former Hong Kong radio reporter Fenella Sung. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. June 4th marks 35 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, when students were slaughtered for demanding democracy in China. In 2024, the Chinese Communist Party is more powerful than ever. Xi Jinping has taken away freedom of the press and freedom of speech in Hong Kong, and he is threatening to invade Taiwan. From the Breaker.news archive, highlights from interviews with Tiananmen Square survivor Zhou Fengsuo and former RTHK Hong Kong reporter Fenella Sung. The interview with Zhou Fengsuo of Humanitarian China originally appeared on the September 29th, 2019 edition of the podcast. The interview with Fenella Sung of Canadian Friends of Hong Kong originally appeared May 27th, 2018. It's the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. Springtime came to Beijing in more ways than one in 1989, but it didn't last long. For more than a month and a half, students, intellectuals, and workers descended on Tiananmen Square in central Beijing. It is regarded as the symbolic center of China. They demanded that China become more democratic and more transparent. They wanted freedom of the press. The protests swelled. Even Russia's Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who helped end communist rule in the USSR, visited Beijing during the protests. The world was watching, but then it all came to a bloody, tragic, violent end when the People's Liberation Army cracked down on June the 4th, 1989. This is what it sounded like when Tom Mintier reported live from Beijing for CNN.
This is the center of Tiananmen Square before it fell. Just before the troops moved in, you see the goddess of democracy, the statue. The students set fire to buses and anything else they could to hold the troops back, but nothing held them back. Brute force and mechanized armor crushed through the barricades they put through, and the automatic weapons fire felled the protesters who stood in their way as they were to have their way on this night.
Thousands of people died. State censors made it the biggest, dirtiest secret of the Chinese Communist government. Before she came to Vancouver, Fenella Sung was a journalist with RTHK in Hong Kong during the 1980s. The translator and former Fairchild radio host is the convener of the Friends of Hong Kong. She sat down with the Breaker to talk about the ugly legacy of the Tiananmen Square massacre, why it should never be forgotten, and what it was like during the spring of 1989 as Hong Kongers prepared for China to take over.
Most people around the world at that time, we've been watching the events unfold. And I think to many of us who've been China watchers for decades, it came really as a shock to us because as we see China starting to open up during the 80s, I think no one would have expected that the army would turn their gun pointing at the students, at civilians, peaceful protesters. And all they want is just to demand for to end corruption, a cleaner government, a fairer government. They didn't even bother to say that, no, we want elections or whatever. It's just that they want a cleaner government so that their life would be less harsh, less difficult, so that it's more equality among different classes. All these are very, very modest requests. And I think it's really sad as we look back today that the very same kind of modest requests are still happening. And but we see the regime haven't changed a bit or even getting worse and worse. And what is even alarming for us around the world is that we see those kind of corruption, those kind of disregard of human rights, the so-called China model that they've been trying to export right now, that there's no level playing field even in terms of the business circles, like the defiance of international ruling, like in what's happening in the South China Sea. We see those kind of trends that happened way back 29 years ago in 1989. Actually, it's still happening or even is getting worse and worse, and exporting those kind of corrupted nature or those kind of evil things around the world. So I think the rest of us, we really should be aware and be alarmed as to what's happening right now, and as to think, not to think that what's happening inside China won't affect us here in Vancouver or here in Canada today. Actually, every minute what's happening there, as what you rightly said, actually it has ripple effect around the world, and including us here in Vancouver.
Supporters of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement held a flash mob-style protest at Aberdeen Centre in Richmond, BC on September 14th. Upwards of 1,000 people surrounded the atrium of the mall and sang "Glory to Hong Kong" in Cantonese and English. One of those who joined in was Zhou Fengsuo, one of the student protest leaders at Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989. After the Chinese army violently quashed the protest on June 4th, 1989, Zhou escaped to his hometown in Xi'an and was later arrested and jailed for a year. He came to the United States in 1995 and is the founder of Humanitarian China, which aims to develop a civil society in China and promote the rule of law, human rights, and freedom of expression. I spoke with Zhou at Aberdeen Centre after the Glory to Hong Kong rally.
Our organization was founded and currently run by the participants of Tiananmen protests. So we have deep connections with Hong Kong protesters now through the Hong Kong Alliance for Democracy. So through them, I knew this event. That's why I'm coming today to show my support as a democracy activist for China.
I asked Zhou Fengsuo about the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square and the intersection with the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, which have gained international attention. But is the world watching enough?
Hong Kong people had fought courageously for the freedom of themselves against the expansion of CCP's totalitarian control. That is threatening the whole world. And I don't think it's appreciated enough by the democratic countries what Hong Kong is doing. And they have won victory. The Hong Kong government has declared a withdrawal of the extradition law, but this is only the surface. The true reason is the true democracy that they deserve or denied by the CCP. That's what they are fighting for. That is the value we should all try to defend. So that's why it's so important for us to show support. And on the other hand, the shadow of CCP is everywhere through globalization and the technology and the digital totalitarianism. So that, I think, itself is a threat to the world. For example, just here we have the Huawei executive being held because this technology company, is basically working as an agent for the Chinese government. That's a good example of how China everything serves the party and the party only. So there's no other way. We have to confront this regime and fight back. That's why what Hong Kong people is doing is so important to us. As a Tiananmen survivor, I'm very grateful about Hong Kong, what they have done in the last 30 years to keep the truth and memory alive. What's happening today is a reincarnation of the Tiananmen democratic movement in Hong Kong. The young people today, they grew up going to the Tiananmen candlelight vigil. And here too, in Vancouver, there's a very strong presence about the Hong Kong people commemorating Tiananmen. That's a very important, essential democratic education for the young generation. That's why today there's such a willingness to fight against the CCP. But in mainland China, the Communist Party has completely controlled people's mind. It's 1984 all over again, even beyond the wildest imagination. Everything people think, even what they are going to think, are under control, under watch. So that's what the kind of future we are all facing. That's what the kind of future that Hong Kong is fighting against.
That was Zhou Fengsuo, a survivor of the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing in 1989 and founder of Humanitarian China. For more information, go to h-china.org. Those were highlights of interviews from the theBreaker.news podcast archives with Zhou Fengsuo of Humanitarian China, which originally appeared in 2019, and Fenella Sung of Canadian Friends of Hong Kong, which originally appeared in 2018. Time on the Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, NVIDIA CEO calls Taiwan one of the most important countries in the world. On his latest visit to Taiwan, which started May 26th, Jensen Huang was spotted strolling through a night market in Taipei. Huang says Taiwan is the center of electronics industry making fast progress in artificial intelligence. In the Hong Kong Free Press, 14 Hong Kong Democrats convicted of subversion conspiracy in landmark national security trial, 2 cleared. Lawrence Lau and Li Yu-shun were acquitted, becoming the first 2 people tried under the Beijing-imposed security law to be cleared of their charges. The 16 were among 47 arrested under the Beijing-imposed security law in January 2021 over their roles in unofficial primaries held in an attempt to understand which candidates to put forward to gain a controlling majority in the upcoming Legislative Council election. In Kyoto news, Hiroshima urges Israel to cease Gaza attack and peace ceremony invite. The invitations to Israeli President Isaac Herzog and the ambassador of Israel to Japan include a call for an immediate ceasefire to the conflict in the Palestinian territory that has drawn increasing international opposition. The Hiroshima city government has been accused of double standards after it emerged in April that while it will invite Israel, it will bar Russia and Belarus from the ceremony for a 3rd straight year over the invasion of Ukraine. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In Willamette Week, worker who fell into package shredder sues food upcycler for $21 million. The lawsuit against Addie's Alternative follows a $28,000 fine from worker safety regulators. Dionisio Ramirez Pablo was working the night shift when a damp package caused the shredder he was operating to jam in May 2022. Upon his manager's instructions, he jumped onto the conveyor belt and fell into the cutting blades, suffering serious leg injuries. The lawsuit accuses the facility's managers of negligence for not adopting proper safety protocols or offering Ramirez Pablo, who spoke little English, sufficient training. In Crosscut, Washington conservative groups are banding together to dump carbon pricing. Redmond hedge fund manager Brian Haywood is spending millions to end Cap and Invest. Since January 2023, the Cap and Invest program has brought about $2 billion into the state budget, mostly to support climate change mitigation, health, and construction programs. Lawmakers allocated more than $800 million of it to buy electric school and transit buses, install electric vehicle charging stations, support salmon recovery and coastline restoration, buy forest land, and restore landscapes destroyed by wildfires. In Czech news, court certifies flooding lawsuit against Abbotsford and BC as class action. BC Supreme Court Justice Dev DeLay says the lawsuit's allegations against the city of Abbotsford potentially affected a significant number of people in the nearby Sumas Prairie area. Abbotsford allegedly failed to close the flood boxes at the Barrowtown pump station during record rainfall in November 2021. In February, the province said it would pay almost $80 million to help upgrade the Barrowtown pump station that was nearly overwhelmed. That's Cascadia calling on this edition of the theBreaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo Bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to Royal Canadian Legions. They're in almost every community across the land. They keep the history of World War II alive. More than 3,500 British Columbians did not come back from the Great War. A good time to visit your local Legion is on June 6th. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo Bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of June 2nd, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 2nd of June in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act? That meant Indigenous people born in the U.S. became citizens of the U.S. Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. Or follow The Breaker News for news as it happens on X, formerly known as Twitter. And you can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. That's patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.